Hello, denizens of the internet. My name is Winnie Weedy Vorthos, and I like to make Vorthos Magic the Gathering decks that are as competitive as possible, and have been doing so for almost the entirety of my years playing MTG. Today, I'll be bringing you another themed deck tech for the modern format, and the theme this time is pretty obvious. The deck is called Mom and Pop's One-Stop Thopter Shop. Ooh, I just love saying that. And the theme is the Nalaar family. That is to say, Chandra Nalaar, Pia Nalaar, and Kiran Nalaar. For those of you who don't know, these three characters are a family within the setting of Magic the Gathering, and their story is one of my personal favorites. I'm not going to go over the whole thing now, but just know that it's pretty sad at times and heartwarming at others. I will give a brief summary of their story just so that you have some better context for the theme of this deck, and if this synopsis is interesting to you, I encourage you to go find the full story of these characters yourself. To make a long story short, the Nalaars were a family on the plane of Kaladesh, with Pia and Kiran working as artificers and Chandra being a little rascal. One day, the Nalaars were accosted by a police officer named Baral, boo this man, while at work, and little Chandra fights back, discovering her ability for pyromancy in the process. The family flees, finding refuge in a village, but are found by Baral, the bastard, who ends up killing Kiran right in front of Chandra. Traumatized, her mother missing and presumed dead, she is brought back to the city of Girapur to face a public execution under false pretenses with Baral, boo this man, to be her executioner. It's then that Chandra's spark ignites and she planeswalks for the first time, escaping death in the process. Chandra would go on to have lots of adventures and do a whole bunch of stuff before eventually returning home to Kaladesh on a different adventure with her super friends, the Gatewatch. It was on this adventure that she discovered that her mother was actually alive, and together would lead a revolution that helped to topple the corrupt elements of the government during an event called the Inventors Fair, with nasty old Baral finally being discovered for the lying dog that he is and imprisoned in disgrace. That's an extremely short version of the tale, but I hope it's given you some insight into the Nalaar family. The strict and vengeful Pia, who for years thought that her daughter had died along with her husband, the kindly martyr of Kiran, who gave his life for his daughter, and the hot-headed Chandra, who did nothing wrong. Their story is tragic and moving, and I once again encourage you to look into it deeper if this brief summary has intrigued you. Mom and Pop's One-Stop Thopter Shop is a deck centered around the Nalaar family, as I said, but rather than focus on the tragic elements of it, I like to imagine that this deck is something of a glimpse into an alternate future where the family didn't meet such a tragedy, where they stuck together and opened up a little shop selling the inventions that Pia and Kiran, the eponymous Mom and Pop, make, while Chandra, set to inherit the shop from her parents one day, begrudgingly works the store while hanging out with her friends after hours and on the weekends, never to deal with the trauma of her actual lore, but instead the drama of teenage life, being a young woman, and capitalism. So that's the theme and narrative that this deck is looking to construct. Now let me give you a brief history on how this deck came to be. The year is 2015, and I am attending my first ever draft. The set is Magic Origins, and I have no real idea of what I'm doing. But I'm here to have fun, get some new cards, and hang out with my friend who had invited me to the event in the first place. I ended up drafting a blue-red deck that was built around 3 cards: Pia and Kiran Nalaar, Thopter Spy Network, and Hangerback Walker. This deck was fairly simple and looked to make a bunch of Thopters using cards like Girapur Gearcrafter and Thopter Engineer along with my rare drafts. I remember doing pretty well with the deck and ended up placing 3rd, I think. That was the very first version of this deck, back before it had a name and a more cohesive identity. I kept the cards because I liked them so much, and it wouldn't be until about a year or so later, whenever the set Kaladesh was released, that the deck would truly be born. As I was looking through the cards from Kaladesh, I said to myself, there sure are a lot of cards featuring Chandra in this set. Which led me to look for those cards specifically, which is how I found Pia Nalaar, and remembered that old draft deck I still had. Seeing Pia by herself made me wonder where Kieran was, as I hadn't seen a card representing him in this set. So I went looking, and found his name on the card, Heart of Kieran, but not the man himself. It wasn't until I went looking in the black cards that I found the man, or at least his epitaph.
What you say? That you only meant well, 'cause you did. What you say? That it's all for the best.
I remember feeling a bit bummed out when I learned that Kieran had died between Magic Origins and the events of Kaladesh. When I intended the draft of Origins, I wasn't paying much attention to the narrative being told on the cards, and so had missed it. Now, though, I went looking for the story that I told you earlier, and, when I returned to the cards themselves, I had a simple thought. Do all of these cards featuring Chandra and her family synergize with one another? And to my surprise, they did. Well, sort of. There was less direct synergy and more of a cohesive theme that I picked up on, which is to say burn and artifacts, specifically Thopters. It isn't just that a lot of the mom and pop cards create Thopters when they enter the battlefield, but it was this card specifically that convinced me to make the deck Thopter orientated. The flavor text is what stuck out the most to me, a quote from Pia herself. "You want to know what we're fighting for? Look at the wonder in that child's eyes." This quote is really what made me imagine what it would have been like for the Nalaar family if Pia and Kieran had been able to open up a little shop selling ornithopters to people as toys and trinkets along with other inventions they had. And so I set about making the deck properly, putting in as many cards which featured the Nalaar family as I could fit into a deck and still make functional. Once the deck was made and I was satisfied with it, I moved on to other decks, but was always on the lookout for ways to improve the Nalaar deck, as I ended up really liking how it played. Slowly, the deck changed piece by piece as new sets and new cards came out, as my understanding of the game grew, and as memes came my way.
Primary draw of red is Magus of the Moon, but Mum and Pup's one-stop Thopter shop is also a big draw to the archetype.
That's right, you all know my secret now. I'm a dirty thief, an unoriginal hack. I didn't come up with a name for this deck. Vince, also known as Pleasant Kenobi, did, and he made it up for a laugh. And I did laugh. I really, truly liked this funny little phrase and thought it was a perfect name, so I unironically adopted it as my own. Pleasant Kenobi, if you ever see this, thanks for the funny name for my funny little deck. So now that the deck had a name, an identity, and a theme, there wasn't anything left to do except to optimize as time went on. And much to my surprise, this deck has seen updates as recently as only a couple of weeks ago as of time of recording. So this is very much a living deck tech, so to speak, that may very well undergo further changes as time goes on. So now that you know what sort of deck we're making, let's move on to the actual deck tech. This is a mono-red artifact mid-range deck that's very aggressive and splashes white for a surprise card or two. The game plan is pretty simple. Play and make Thopters, artifact creatures, Mom and Pop, and Chandra, and either beat our opponents with an onslaught of flying 1/1s or burn our opponents with spells and effects. It's straightforward, but far from being brain dead. This is a mid-range deck ultimately. It's not fast or aggressive enough to be truly aggro in nature. It wants to outvalue your opponents through evasive threats, synergies, and powerful cards that are good at basically any point in the game. To win with this deck, you want to be aggressive but not hot-headed. You need to know when best to attack, when to hold back, and most importantly, when it's appropriate to use your burn spells and how. It's hard for me to say which cards truly qualify as win conditions in this deck, because this deck isn't designed to play any one game-ending card. Instead, it wins through bits of damage all throughout the game and synergies between cards. However, if I had to narrow it down to cards that could win you the game on their own, I'd have to go with Heart of Kirin, Chandra, Torch of Defiance, and Urza's Saga as my main picks for cards that can win you the game on their own merit. The Heart of Kirin, Pop's treasured vehicle that he's kept since high school in pristine condition, rather than a symbol of the resolve of rebellion against an unjust system of oppression, if you will, is a 2-mana vehicle that, when crewed, becomes a 4/4 flying vigilance beater with a crew cost of 3. For those of you who don't know, that means that this becomes an artifact creature when you tap any number of creatures with total power 3 or greater, but is simply an artifact when not crewed. It also has the unique ability of being able to remove a loyalty counter from a planeswalker in order to pay its crew cost. Heart of Kirin, Pop's car, is one of the biggest sometimes creatures that we play in this deck, and works as both an attacker and defender thanks to vigilance. The ability to be crewed by the removal of a loyalty counter is very nice, as it means we don't always have to dedicate our creatures to the heart in order to attack with it, and in combination with the other creatures we play, namely our small army of flying Thopters, it can end games pretty quickly if not removed. It comes down early and can hit hard, which is why we're running 3 of them. Chandra, Torch of Defiance, who comes and helps out with the shop begrudgingly because she loves her parents but would never admit it because she's just too punk for that, is probably the best Chandra planeswalker that's ever been printed. For 4 mana, 2 generic and 2 red, we get a 4 loyalty planeswalker with 4 abilities. +1 and you exile the top card of your library. You may cast it this turn, but if you don't or can't, Chandra deals 2 damage to each opponent. I like to imagine this ability as Chandra hating dealing with customers and lashing out with attitude when they don't like what she tries to sell them. Anyway, her second ability adds 1 loyalty counter and adds 2 red mana to your mana pool. Her third ability is -3 to deal 4 damage to any creature. Finally, her ultimate ability is -7 and you get an emblem that burns our opponents or creatures they control for 5 damage every time we cast any sort of spell. Truly, it's Chandra's first 2 abilities that see the most use in this deck, but all 4 of them are useful. The most important ability is her +1 to add 2 red mana to your mana pool. I wouldn't describe this deck as particularly mana hungry, but typically speaking, the more spells we cast the better. So having an on-demand 2 mana each and every turn for free after she comes down is excellent. But her first ability shouldn't be ignored either. Its card advantage, its burn, and it synergizes particularly well with another card we'll go over later. The third ability will see the least amount of play, as we're running a bevy of burn spells that should already be dealing with creatures our opponents are playing, but it's an option to be used if need be. Finally, her -7 can and will win you the game if you manage to get her there. That's the problem though, getting there. Torch of Defiance is a well-known, powerful card that most players will try to kill on sight to keep her from running away with the game, so it's rare that she actually gets up to her 7 loyalty or beyond. If she does get there though, the game is pretty much yours. Just cast spells and have her emblem do all the work. An extremely solid card, we're running 3 copies of her. Urza's Saga is the last card I would describe as a win condition in this deck, and it's entirely for its second chapter ability. I'm sure I don't have to explain Urza's Saga to most of you, but for those who don't know, it's an enchantment land saga that has 3 chapters that trigger when it enters play and on your draw step. The first ability lets you tap for colorless mana. The second ability lets you tap 2 mana and it in order to make a construct token that has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts you have in play. The last ability lets you go search up an artifact with mana value 0 or 1 and put it directly on the battlefield. Then, when the last chapter triggers, you sacrifice it. This is maybe the singularly most powerful card in the deck just on its own right, and it shouldn't be surprising. It's taken Modern by storm and is in all sorts of decks for all kinds of reasons. But for mom and pops, it's here for the second ability. This deck churns out a lot of artifacts, and that means we get to make huge constructs. Big beaters for big damage are just the sort of thing we like to see, and if they can't be dealt with, the constructs that this card makes can win you the game on their own. The only downside to running the Saga, other than the fact it sacrifices itself after 3 turns, is that we're actually running it suboptimally with only one target for its last chapter ability. Thankfully, putting an artifact into play directly synergizes with the constructs it makes, so it's ultimately not the biggest deal that we only have one target for this, but it is something to keep in mind nonetheless. I also don't feel the need to explain this to veteran players, but again, for those of you unfamiliar with Urza's Saga, a bit of advice. Play this on turn 2 and onwards if you can help it, never turn 1. The reason being that you can create up to 2 constructs with this by spending your turn 3 to make the second one, and then responding to its 3rd chapter triggering on turn 4 to tap it and make a second construct before it gets sacrificed. It's a cute little trick that gives you up to 2 powerful artifact creatures. Welcome to sequencing, we run a full playset. So those are the tentative win conditions of the deck, but honestly it's rare that you'll win the game off of just these cards alone. It happens occasionally, but not often enough that I actually feel comfortable saying that these are the winning games for this deck. Mom and Pop sees value in every piece of hardware that they have for sale in the shop, and this is just 2 of them that come along with their hot-blooded daughter. The rest of the deck simply works together in order to win the game, and so there are no secondary win cons in this deck. With that in mind, let's move on to the creatures. This deck is running a pretty robust package of on-theme creatures that all synergize with each other pretty well in different ways and scenarios. Let's start with the owners of our local Thopter business, Mom and Pop. Pia and Chandra Nalaar, Mom and Pop, the creature that started it all, is a 4-mana legendary human artificer for 2 generic and 2 red mana that has 2 power and toughness. When Mom and Pop enter the shop, they create 2 1/1 flying Thopter tokens. For 3 mana, 2 generic and a red, they can sacrifice an artifact you control to shock something for 2 damage. This is the bread and butter of this deck, the face of the shop, and as such it does literally everything we want it to do. It's on theme, it makes Thopters, it deals some burn damage. Perfect, concise, clean. Sacrificing an artifact to shoot something might seem like a downside, but trust me, it's not that big of a deal. Not only does this deck run or generate tons of artifacts, but there are plenty of scenarios where we'd rather give up something of ours for an extra bit of damage. It's possible that last 2 points of damage that Mom and Pop makes can win you the game, so try not to be too stingy with the artifacts you sacrifice, especially when there's a benefit for doing so. The only real downside is that they cost 4 mana to cast and are legendary, so for that reason we're only running 2 of them. Pia Nalaar, Mom the First, is a 3-mana human artificer for 2 generic and a red with 2 power and toughness. When she enters the shop by herself, she makes a 1/1 flying Thopter creature token, and she has 2 abilities. For 2 mana, 1 generic and a red, she can beef up an artifact creature 1 power at a time. For 1 generic mana, she can sacrifice an artifact to make it so that a creature can't block this turn. Pia Nalaar is a wonderfully designed card for ludonarrative reasons when compared to Pia and Chandra Nalaar, really demonstrating the anguish and loss of Kieran by generating 1 less Thopter upon ETB, making artifact creatures more aggressive by boosting their power, and sacrificing artifacts, not to potentially remove other creatures, but instead make it so that they can't block, distracting them, so to speak. It's beautiful the way it tells the story of how Pia persisted after the death of her husband, but in our deck and for our purposes, Mom shows up to deal with unruly customers. She's definitely the manager of the shop that helps Chandra deal with customers when they get uppity. Funnily enough, when looked at from that perspective, Mom shows us where Chandra gets her temper from. But I like to imagine that Pia more uses sharp words than outright getting physically violent like Chandra does. Anyways, Pia Nalaar is a miniature version of Pia and Kieran and does basically everything we want it to do in this deck, but slightly different. She makes bodies, she pumps up artifact creatures, she gives us ways to get in for more damage. We're running 3 copies of Mom the First. Pia Nalaar, Consul of Revival, Mom the Second, is one of the newest additions to the deck that I hinted at earlier in this video. For 2 mana, 1 red and 1 white, we get a legendary human artificer with 2 power and 3 toughness that makes it so that all Thopters we control have haste. She can also generate a Thopter whenever we play lands or cast spells from exile. I love this card and everything it does for the deck. Mom the Second really turns the aggression up in this deck a whole nother notch by giving all of our Thopters, of which we make plenty, haste, and she can repeatedly generate Thopter tokens when we play stuff from exile. We've seen one way to do this already in Chandra, Torch of Defiance, but there are 2 other cards we're running in this deck that turn this ability on, as well as giving her synergy with a good amount of cards we're playing. I also really love the flavor text on this card. It's a nice summary of Pia's personal story that uses alliteration to describe her. Renegade, turned revolutionary, turned rebuilder. A perfect summary of her character and a nice way to sum up what she does for the deck. I like to imagine that this version of Mom has her fingers on the pulse of the market, keeping her and Kieran's little locally owned store competitive with big business chain stores by pulling new products seemingly out of nowhere. We're running 3 copies of her only because of her legendary status. Rhea's Apprentice is a 3 mana artifact creature human artificer for 2 generic and 1 red with 2 power and 3 toughness. When the Apprentice enters the battlefield, it creates a 1/1 flying Thopter token, and we can tap it, sacrifice an artifact, and choose one of 2 abilities. Either we exile the top card of our library and we can play that card until the end of our next turn, or we boost up a creature's power by 2 until the end of the turn. Rhea's Apprentice is another card that just kinda does everything we want in this deck, making it more aggressive overall and managing to stay on theme as well by generating a Thopter. Its first tapped ability directly synergizes with Mom the Second, and its second ability is a more aggressive version of Mom the First's pump ability. I like to imagine that Rhea's Apprentice is a new hire or intern at the shop. The one-stop Thopter shop is expanding and they need new hires to keep the business running smoothly. Lovely! We're running 3 of them. Next up we have Walking Ballista, the first of many products which are sold in the shop. Another card I feel needs little to no introduction. Walking Ballista is an artifact creature construct for double X mana that enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. For 4 generic mana we can add another counter to the Ballista, and, at will, we can remove a counter to ping something for 1 damage per counter. Walking Ballista is a very powerful card that's seen play in all sorts of decks ever since it was first put into circulation, and it's no less powerful in our deck. We can play it as early as turn 2 and use it to block and then shoot something for 1 damage, or it can come down later and just get bigger and bigger, able to deal more and more damage. If it's left alone, we can manually make it larger as well. This is a top seller in the shop that can serve a wide variety of purposes for us, definitely one of Mom and Pop's better inventions. And yes, for the narrative of this deck, they did invent the Ballista. 3 copies. The next product that's sold in the shop is Hangerback Walker, yet another card that's pretty famous, I feel. It's an artifact creature construct with double X that enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters just like Ballista does. When it dies, we make a number of 1/1 flying Thopters equal to the number of +1 counters on it, and for 1 generic mana and tapping it, we can add a counter onto the Walker. The other card that started it all, there is no way that Hangerback Walker wasn't going to be in this deck. It's amazing. Playable at any point in the game just like Ballista is, it makes us flying bodies when it dies, it can grow itself, and, most importantly, we don't care that it dies. In fact, a lot of the times we want it to so that we can get access to those sweet, sweet Thopters. Of course, having a big beater is nice, but Hangerback Walker is a premium target for all of our sacrifice effects, generating nothing but value for us when we sacrifice it. Another top seller in Mom and Pop's shop. It's a shame we only have room for 3 of them. The last piece of merchandise that Mom and Pop have for sale, and their first product that put their humble business on the map, Thopter, is a 0 mana artifact creature Thopter with 0 power and 2 toughness and flying. This humble piece of hardware is the backbone of this deck, strange as that might sound, being a Thopter creature, which we very much care about having, an artifact which is relevant for cards like Urza's Saga, our only searchable target with the saga, Chandra Nalaar, Pia and Kieran, and Brea's Apprentice. It might not look like much, but it's free to play, can work as a blocker or sacrifice fodder, a target to be buffed, an outlet to buff our construct tokens from Urza's Saga, and a cheeky way to either annoy our opponents or get in for free damage, as you'll see a bit later. There's not much else to say about this unassuming piece of flying mechanical wonderment. We're running 3 of them, and for maximum flavor, you'll want to run this version specifically from Kaladesh, as that's the model that Mom and Pop created themselves. Those are all of the creatures in the deck, and the bulk of the deck itself. Next up are our instants, and they round out the rest of the main board that aren't lands. It wouldn't be a red deck without Lightning Bolt, would it? Ubiquitous, powerful, it needs no introduction. 1 red mana for 3 damage to anything we want. It's perfect, no notes. Well, 1 note. Know when to throw this at your opponent's face and when to use it as a removal spell. If this can kill a creature and make way for our army of Thopters, shop workers, and products to get in and deal damage, or can just get rid of something that's troubling you, use it for that. Any other time, send it straight to your opponent's life total. Bolt in combination with all of the small bits of damage we do here and there throughout will help you win the game, but it won't if you just haphazardly throw it at your opponent's life total. Don't let Chandra know where Pop keeps all the bolts, or else she will just throw them at customers and waste them, basically. We're running a full playset. Similarly, but less known, Galvanic Blast is an instant for 1 red mana that deals 2 damage to any target unless we control 3 or more artifacts. At that point, it deals 4 damage instead, a sometimes better Lightning Bolt. It's really easy to turn on Metalcraft in this deck, as I'm sure you figured out by now, and we use this exactly the same way as we use Bolt. Sometimes it's more valuable to hit a creature or planeswalker with this, especially if a Bolt alone can't do the job. Sometimes it's better to throw it at our opponent and end the game faster. Pick and choose your targets, don't let Chandra know where they're stored, another full playset. The last non-land card in the main deck, and the newest addition, Virtue of Courage / Imbreth Blaze, is an adventure enchantment. Imbreth Blaze is an instant for 2 mana that deals 2 damage to any target, then it goes on an adventure, exiling itself to be cast once we feel like it. Virtue of Courage, on the other side, is an enchantment for 5 mana, 3 generic and 2 red, that reads, when a card we control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, we may exile that many cards from the top of our library and play them this turn. To be honest with you, I'm still a bit uncertain about this card over some others I was considering, but at face value, this seems like the best fit for this deck, which is why it's being featured here instead of cards like Bone Crusher Giant and Questing Druid. All 3 of these cards are adventures, which we care about because of the fact we can cast them from exile, synergizing with Mom II in order to make more Thopters for us. Ultimately, I decided on just Virtue of Courage over the other 2 for the simple fact that the enchantment part of this card enables that interaction with Mom II much more consistently. We have a lot of ways of dealing non-combat damage to our opponents in this deck, whether it's from burn spells, Ballista, Chandra's +1, or Pia and Kieran's ability. So if we play this and deal that non-combat damage, we're generating essentially extra card draw for ourselves on top of bodies when we play those cards. I can very easily see an argument being made for Bone Crusher Giant over the Virtue simply because it's cheaper to cast, a big body, and deals damage when it's targeted. It's a good card. Similarly, the Seek the Beast side of Questing Druid would be very good for this purpose, essentially letting us draw 2 cards and generate Thopters with Mom II out. I wouldn't even care if we couldn't cast the creature side. which we technically could thanks to one land we're running. It's that adventure where all of the value lies in this deck. Each of these cards make good additions in their own right, but ultimately, the mechanical advantage as well as the burn spell afforded by the virtue seemed like the best fit to me. That and, well, the Nalaar family is nothing if not courageous, keeping the doors open in spite of competition from big business companies. Support your local businesses. We run 3 copies of Virtue of Courage. That's it for the spells in the main deck. Now it's time we moved on to the mana base. I've already mentioned Urza's Saga as a full playset, so we know that's there, but what other lands are supporting the funny little corner shop selling Thopters? Inventor's Fair is great for this deck. A legendary land that gives us 1 life at the beginning of our upkeep if we control 3 or more artifacts, taps for a colorless, and for 4 mana we can tap it, sacrifice it, and search our deck for any artifact we might need. Not only is this on flavor for this deck, centered around the Nalaar family who set up shop in Kaladesh, their home plane, it's a great bit of utility for us. Getting 3 artifacts is easy in this deck. It's practically guaranteed to happen on turn 3 if we have an Urza's Saga in our opening hand, and gaining that little bit of life buffer at the beginning of our upkeep is a nice touch. If need be, sacrificing it to search for an artifact can be clutch to help us win the game by grabbing whatever we might need in the moment. The only downside is that it's legendary, which is why we're only running 2 copies of it. I'm sure most of you saw this coming, but Arid Mesa and Sacred Foundry are our fetch and shock lands of choice, given the colors we're running. The only card with white in it we're running in the main board is Mom II, so we don't really need all that much access to white mana, but these 8 lands make it easy for us to get it on demand. Next up, we're actually running Rustvale Bridge, which might seem a bit strange at first, but think about it. It's another white source, so it ups our consistency of drawing white from Mon II and other cards, but most importantly, it's an artifact that we can easily pitch to one of our many sacrifice effects to help boost up the board so we aren't locked into sacrificing one of our Thopter tokens, or, potentially, worse yet, one of our artifact creatures. I know I said that we want to target Hangerback Walker first, but that doesn't mean we always have to. The bridge makes for a nice alternative target when our creatures are too valuable to lose to our own effects. As a last and obvious note, it's an artifact, so it'll beef up our constructs made from Urza's Saga as well. It does enter the battlefield tapped though, which is a bummer, but that's why we're only running 2 copies of it. It's nice to have, but not nice enough to risk severely slowing the deck down over. The last non-basic land we're running in the deck is Treasure Vault, and we're running 2 copies of it. Like Rustvale Bridge, it's an artifact, so it counts for all the same purposes that the bridge does, but what's nice about Treasure Vault is that we can sacrifice it in order to make more artifacts in the form of treasure tokens. Those tokens will give us more mana, more artifacts for sacrificing, or construct counting, so it really can come in clutch if we make it to the mid and late game and just need a bit more mana than what lands we have can produce on their own. Activate this on your opponent's end step and then spend your next turn going to town doing any number of things. You can't go wrong. The last lands we're running in the deck are good old-fashioned basic mountains, 5 of them for 23 lands in total. That's it for the main deck, but what about the sideboard? Our sideboard, as it is now, is mostly geared towards being more aggressive and more controlling in games 2 and onwards, as we need it to be. The first card in the sideboard is Shrapnel Blast, a 2-mana instant for 1 generic and a red that requires us to sacrifice another artifact as an additional casting cost, but in exchange, we get to deal 5 damage to any target. This is a great burn spell for a deck running a lot of artifacts like ours, and 5 damage is nice and beefy, hitting some of the most annoying threats that our normal burn spells can't deal with by themselves, like Sheoldred, Murktide, and Territorial Kavu. As previously stated, sacrificing an artifact isn't really a big deal in this deck, and if there's nothing we want or need to remove, we can always aim it at our opponent's life directly to erase a nice clean 25% of their life. Not bad for 2 mana, we're running 4 of them. The original reason that this deck turned to white before Mon II came along, Rip Apart is an instant for 2 mana in Boros colors with 2 modes. We can either bolt a creature or planeswalker, or we can destroy an artifact or enchantment of our choice. Fun fact, this deck used to dip into green instead for Destructive Revelry, but then Strixhaven came along and printed what amounted to an upgrade to the Revelry that was more versatile, letting us hit a creature if we want on top of dealing 1 more damage and having the same targets as Revelry does. The only real difference is that Revelry both destroys something and deals damage, but I genuinely feel that Rip Apart is just the better card overall. And even if I didn't feel that, Mon II was inevitably going to make this deck splash white anyways from the instant Wizards decided to make her Boros colors, so call it a nice twist of fate. We're running 3 of them. Next up, we're running a personal favorite of mine, Pia's Revolution. A lot of you probably don't remember this card, so let me give you a refresher. For 3 mana, 2 and a red, we get an enchantment that reads, whenever a non-token artifact we control is put into the graveyard, return it to your hand unless an opponent has Pia's Revolution deal 3 damage to them. One of the all-time great cards for this deck. It has been here since nearly the beginning and for good reason. It's so good in this deck. Just think of all the artifact sacrificing we do in this deck with Pia's Revolution out. Think about Ornithopter, humble little Ornithopter, 0 mana 0/2 flying Thopter that we can use to block infinitely unless our opponents willingly hurt themselves to keep it in the grave. Do you know how annoying that gets for your opponent to have to make that choice repeatedly? Apply that logic to all the other non-token artifacts in this deck. Ballista, you remove the last counter from it, do we get it back, or are you going to bolt yourself? You blocked with a Hangerback Walker and it dies. Awesome! We get some Thopters and we get the Walker back unless our opponent bolts themselves. Did you just sacrifice Treasure Vault? Do I get it back, or do you bolt? So on and so forth. This card is severely underrated, I love it to pieces. We're running 3 of them. Quick Flare is our board wipe of choice in this deck. For 2 mana, 1 generic and 1 red, we get a sorcery that deals 2 damage to all non-artifact creatures. This is a unique damage-based board wipe that in our deck is mostly one-sided. The majority of our creatures are artifacts in this deck, and even though it does hit Mom I and Mom and Pop, it's an even trade for more than likely getting rid of any small creatures our opponents might be running. Annoyances like Ragavan, gone. Mana Dorks, burnt. Bowmasters, crispy. And all of our creatures will be just fine. Now, this is only 2 damage, so it's only going to take care of the smallest of threats, but a board wipe is a board wipe, and in some matchups, that's what we'll want. A lot of the time, our beefier burn spells will be able to deal with the larger threats, but for decks that like to go wide with a bunch of little guys, Whip Flare can be invaluable. We're running 2 of them. Void Mirror is here to counter all of the worst things running around in Modern right now. Evoke elementals, cascade targets, free spells, suspend spells, all countered by the mirror, which is great for us because while we can deal with a lot of these things if the cards are in our favor, we can't deal with all of them. It's also an artifact which helps us with the overall synergy of the deck. 2 copies. Our last card is Mechanized Warfare, an enchantment for 3 mana, 1 generic and 2 red, that makes it so that if any artifact or red source we control would deal damage to something, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. This card is in the deck for one reason and one reason only, the race. Our matchup against aggressive decks like Burn and Merfolk are pretty 50-50. It's a question of who runs out of gas first usually. While our deck is pretty well suited to operate in the mid to late game, we don't want to give decks, which are lower to the ground, the chance to stabilize themselves if we can help it. If we spend all our early game removing their threats and only dealing so much damage, we need ways to pick up the pace. That's what this enchantment is for, making literally everything in our deck that can deal damage deal just a little bit more. It adds up quickly. I honestly wish we had more room to play more of this card because I feel it's very good. But sadly, we only have room for 1 copy, so that's what we're running. And that's the deck! Mom and Pop's one-stop Thopter shop. A red artifact mid-range deck with a splash of white that features the Nalaar family as the focal point, filled to the brim with flavor and balanced with efficient, powerful cards to support our local artificers. Every card in this deck is put in there for a purpose, and most of them are either related or feature everyone's favorite pyromancer and her parents who love her to bits and just want her to take over the shop for them when they retire. But what if you wanted to have more efficiency than flavor? What if you care about making the deck as powerful as possible with only a minimal amount of flavor? There are several ways to improve the deck in that manner that I will go over now. Recommending upgrades for this deck is pretty easy, all things considered, because the things you can put in to upgrade it are fairly obvious if you think about it. First off, you can very easily run both Fury and Solitude in some measure for extra bits of removal that don't entirely rely on damage, as well as Ephemerate to scam them into play. Ephemerate would pull double duty as an upgrade for this deck, since there are so many cards that create Thopters when they enter the battlefield, giving you more targets than just the elementals. Another possible upgrade is Liberator, Urza's Battle Thopter, a sweet legendary Thopter that can make for one hell of an upgraded piece of stock for mom and pop's shop. Giving you the ability to hold cards in your hand and play the ambush game feels like a great thing to do if you prefer playing more of a reserved, controlling game, and Liberator will grow pretty big pretty quickly if you sequence your spells correctly on curve. I honestly would love to find some room for this, but I'm not sure what I'd want to cut, but you might see something that could easily be replaced. If you want to beef up your board wipes, Vorthos has plenty of ways to upgrade Whip Flare. Anger the Gods doesn't just deal more damage, but it'll exile things as well. Blasphemous Act makes sure basically nothing survives, and this deck can make a fairly substantial amount of creatures, so getting the cost reduction isn't out of the question in the slightest. Wrath of God could be put in if you prefer a non-damage based board wipe, and Farewell lets you pick and choose what you want to wipe. It's not unreasonable to expect the game to get to the point where you have 6 mana, but it should be noted that using Farewell definitely tips this deck towards more of a control or tempo direction rather than mid-range, and you should keep in mind for all of these that they will hit your creatures too. If you don't mind those facts though, these are solid options for giving your deck a bit more of a broad punch. The last upgrades I'll suggest are putting in more targets for Urza Saga, and there are plenty of things you can choose from. If you don't mind being a worse Hammer Time deck, you could run Colossus Hammer, for instance, and make the funniest Ornithopter ever. As a matter of fact, Sigarda's Aid could be something else you put in the deck if you run more equipment like Hammer or Shadow Spear. Pyrite Spellbomb is another solid option for Urza Saga in Boros colors, and I honestly could keep going on, but I'm sure you know of or can think of plenty of artifacts that Saga can go search up and make use of. Now, we've gone over the deck, we've gone over upgrades you could make if you wanted them, but what about weaknesses? Where does this deck struggle the most? Like most creature-based aggressive decks, this deck struggles against control matchups or decks that run a lot of removal. We're very much an on-board kind of deck. We need our things to stick around in order to do work for us, because we can't win the game through burn spells alone. Counter spells, cheap and efficient removal, or more unorthodox removal that we can't get rid of without specific tech can be tough for this deck to deal with. Something else that this deck struggles with is enchantment and artifact removal. We have some in the form of Rip Apart, but that's it really, not much ultimately. If it can't be dealt with damage, we're naturally going to struggle because this deck isn't designed to be a control or aggro deck, it's mid-range. We want to attack with our Thopters, burn face, or otherwise deal damage to get our victory because that's just who the Nalaars are. Point being, in games where you need Rip Apart, choose wisely because you won't have many chances to get rid of what you need gone. Lastly, this deck doesn't do so well against decks that do fundamentally unfair things. And by that I mean decks that simply don't care about what we're doing because they're on the fast track to winning on the spot 3 turns from now. Combo decks, cascade decks, or decks that use absurdly valuable cards are likely to just run away with the game before this deck can catch up. We're running a lot of burn and we have a lot of ways to make Thopters, but you have to remember, they're just little guys. a Thopter isn't going to end up doing much against an opponent that manages to play prime time on turn 3, or a living end player who spent the first 3 turns of the game filling their graveyard with big things that they can reanimate with an instant noodle board state. But I feel like I've done a pretty good job of fleshing this deck out. I've gone over its strengths, weaknesses, given a bit of story and how it came to be made, and made suggestions for upgrades you could make if you were so inclined. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you do, please consider subscribing for more deck techs in the future, hitting the like button, and leaving a comment of some kind, sharing with anyone you think might be interested in this kind of content. This is a new channel and I'm hoping to make a name for myself and all other Vorthos players out there. Until next time, I've been Weenie Weedy Vorthos, and thank you for watching.